It remains one of the most haunting and controversial events of the 20th century. A moment so vast in scale and so filled with human tragedy that even today people struggle to understand how it unfolded with such speed and brutality. The Partition of India in 1947 is commonly explained as an unfortunate, but necessary step to resolve rising Hindu-Muslim tensions. But when we look beneath the surface, the simplicity of that narrative begins to unravel. How could a subcontinent of 400 million people be divided in just a few weeks? How could colonies, armies, states, borders, wealth, and entire populations be separated with almost no preparation? And most importantly, was this division the result of historical forces spiraling out of control? Or was it a rushed political decision carried out for reasons far deeper than what is taught in textbooks? To understand why the British Empire chose to leave when it did, and why partition happened so quickly, we must first look at the long history that led to this moment. The roots of division go far deeper than the 1940s. British administrators had long believed that India was too diverse to be governed as one entity. Letters written by colonial officers in the 19th century openly described India as an empire of races, languages, and religions that could only be controlled by carefully encouraging divisions. Policies introduced over the decades, from the division of Bengal in 1905 to the creation of separate electorates in 1909, worked to institutionalize differences between Hindus and Muslims. These decisions did not create communal tension from nothing, but they hardened political identities and made collaboration more difficult. By the time the Second World War ended, British leaders had begun referring to Hindu-Muslim conflict as a justification for rapid withdrawal. Even though many of the structural causes of that conflict were rooted in colonial strategy. When World War II ended in 1945, Britain was exhausted financially, militarily, and politically. Maintaining the empire had become impossible. Prime Minister Clement Attlee knew that independence for India was unavoidable. But the speed he demanded shocked even Britain's own officials. Many historians argue that Britain wanted to exit before the situation in India became too volatile to control. Others believe Britain feared the rising influence of the Soviet Union and wanted to prevent India from drifting toward communist alliances. Whatever the motive, a deadline was set. Britain would leave by June 1948. Indian political negotiations soon turned into a race against time. Congress pushed for a strong, centralized India. The Muslim League insisted on safeguards or a separate state to prevent Muslim-majority provinces from being dominated by the center. The British, instead of slowing down or forcing compromise, accelerated the timetable further. When Lord Louis Mountbatten arrived in March 1947 as the last viceroy, he faced enormous pressure to find a solution quickly. Mountbatten, energetic but inexperienced in Indian politics, decided almost immediately that partition was the only workable option. And then he did something unprecedented. He advanced the date of British withdrawal from mid-1948 to August 1947, cutting nearly a full year from the original plan. This decision transformed an already complicated political negotiation into a frantic, chaotic rush. Provinces had weeks to decide whether to join India or Pakistan. Princely states, which numbered more than 560, had to determine their future. Armies, civil servants, police forces, and national assets needed to be divided. And perhaps most dangerously, millions of ordinary people had no clear idea where the new borders would fall. In Punjab and Bengal, two of the most diverse regions of the subcontinent, entire communities waited in confusion and fear, hearing rumors but receiving no official information. Mountbatten himself admitted later that the speed was a calculated risk, but on the ground, it was far more than a risk. It was a recipe for disaster. Amid this chaos, a single individual was tasked with drawing the actual borders between India and Pakistan. His name was Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never been to India before. He did not know its geography, its languages, or its social complexities. He was given no detailed census maps, no adequate administrative records. And almost no time, just 5 weeks to draw boundaries that would decide the fate of 88 million people in Punjab and Bengal alone. Radcliffe later confessed that he had destroyed all his working papers because he did not want anyone to know how little information he had relied on. He claimed he tried to be fair, but fairness was almost impossible under such conditions. As negotiations continued among Indian leaders, distrust deepened. Jinnah, who had once been celebrated as a champion of Hindu-Muslim unity, now believed that a strong central government dominated by Congress would permanently disadvantage Muslims. Nehru and Patel, on the other hand, feared that too much decentralization would weaken a future Indian state. Every proposal collapsed amid suspicion. The failure of the Cabinet Mission Plan in 1946 convinced Jinnah that only a separate nation could protect Muslim interests. The violent events in Bengal, Bihar, and Punjab intensified his belief. Meanwhile, Congress leaders felt that delaying independence would only cause more instability. With both sides locked in opposing visions and the British refusing to provide more time, the momentum toward partition became unstoppable. But even as the political decision was made, almost nothing was done to prepare for what would follow. There were no plans for mass migration because the British and Indian leaders believed or perhaps hoped that very few people would move. There were no arrangements for protecting minorities, no strategies for controlling armed militias, and no systems for safely transferring land, homes, or property. Punjab, which had some of the continent's most mixed populations, had virtually no preparation for division. Bengal, equally complex, faced the same neglect. Civil servants were confused. Local administrations were overwhelmed. And as rumors spread, armed groups began preparing for violence long before any official announcement. In this rapidly deteriorating atmosphere, Mountbatten hastened the final steps. He presented his plan in June 1947. Within days, it was accepted by Congress and the Muslim League. The date of independence was set for August 15th, barely 2 months away. Across the subcontinent, millions of people woke up to the news that their lives, homes, and futures would soon be reshaped forever. But they still did not know where the borders would fall. That information would only come after independence, on August 17th. This delay was catastrophic. In those tense days, communities were left guessing. Would their village be part of India or Pakistan? Would their neighbors stay or leave? Panic spread like wildfire. Trains began filling with families desperate to escape. Armed groups exploited the uncertainty, planning attacks and retaliations. Local police forces cracked under pressure. British troops remained passive, claiming they no longer had authority to intervene. Indian and Pakistani administrations had not yet formed. The machinery of the state was collapsing, but the violence was accelerating. By the time independence arrived, the tragedy was already unfolding. The celebrations in Delhi, Karachi, and other major cities could not hide the horror spreading through Punjab, Bengal, Sindh, and the northwest frontier. Riots erupted, villages burned. Trains carrying refugees were stopped and attacked. Entire caravans disappeared. The full scale of the disaster was not yet visible, but the storm had already begun sweeping across the land. As the weeks moved forward, Mountbatten realized that every attempt to slow the process only made the instability worse. The Punjab boundary was on fire, Bengal was tense, Sindh was beginning to split socially, and the northwest frontier province had already become an arena of ideological contest. In this environment, maintaining the facade of a united administration became almost impossible. British officers were preparing to leave, Indian officers were divided, and the military command, one of the most organized institutions of the Raj, was no longer functioning as a unified body. The army that once formed the backbone of British power in India had split along communal lines, and the officers themselves were unsure where they would be stationed after independence. In such a condition, executing a controlled, slow transition was becoming less realistic. Meanwhile, Jinnah's health was deteriorating rapidly, a fact that Mountbatten and a few others knew but never discussed publicly. This added another layer of urgency. Many historians believe that the British feared that if Jinnah died before a political settlement was reached, the entire Muslim League leadership would collapse, making negotiations impossible and plunging the subcontinent further into chaos. Jinnah's weakened condition, combined with his unshakable determination, created a situation where speeding up the transfer of power seemed like the only way to ensure Pakistan would emerge as a stable, recognized nation. Whether this urgency was humanitarian concern, political strategy, or simply fear of greater disorder remains debated. Nehru and Patel were facing equal pressures. Every day, reports of new massacres and retaliatory attacks reached Delhi. Congress leaders believed that a delay in announcing final borders would give extremists more time to create facts on the ground. They feared that if Punjab descended further into violence, the central idea of a stable India would collapse. Patel, known for his firmness, privately argued that a quick, clean division was better than a prolonged period of uncertainty that bred chaos. Nehru, though more idealistic, agreed that the situation needed immediate resolution, even if that meant accepting a division he emotionally disliked. Gandhi alone remained hopeful that unity could still be preserved, but by mid-1947, his influence over practical political decisions had weakened before the tide of reality. At the same time, Cyril Radcliffe, an English lawyer who had never been to India, was appointed to draw the borders between India and Pakistan. He had just 5 weeks to divide territories that had centuries of intertwined history, shared rivers, mixed populations, and complex cultural patterns. The speed of this process has remained one of the most criticized aspects of partition. Radcliffe had almost no familiarity with the local geography or demography. He relied heavily on outdated maps, limited census data, and the advice of officials who themselves were influenced by political pressure and personal loyalties. The result was a boundary that cut through villages, farmlands, homes, irrigation systems, railway lines, and even ancient marketplaces, creating an artificial divide that generated confusion and tension on the ground. When Independence Day arrived the 14th of August for Pakistan and 15 August for India, the borders had not even been officially revealed. People celebrated freedom without knowing which country their homes belonged to. When the Radcliffe Line was finally announced on the 17th of August, shockwaves followed. Many communities that had prepared to be part of one country found themselves suddenly assigned to the other. This sudden change triggered a mass migration unprecedented in modern history. Nearly 15 million people crossed borders in both directions, often with no guidance, no security, and no clarity on where they could settle. The violence that followed massacres, kidnappings, arson, forced conversions, and revenge killings turned partition into one of the bloodiest human tragedies of the 20th century. Some historians argue that the British rushed the process to avoid responsibility for the humanitarian disaster they knew was coming. The transfer of power date announced just 6 weeks earlier was too abrupt for administrative systems to adapt, for local governments to be established, or for security forces to be adequately reorganized. Even British troops were unwilling to intervene in riots, believing it was no longer their responsibility. Mountbatten later admitted in interviews that he underestimated the scale of violence and was shocked by the brutality that unfolded. Critics argue that he prioritized leaving India on a positive personal note rather than ensuring a meticulously planned, safe transition. Yet there is another argument, which claims the rush was not a failure of planning but a strategic decision. Many British officials feared the Soviet influence spreading toward the Indian Ocean. A prolonged conflict between Congress and the Muslim League could destabilize the region, creating a vacuum for foreign powers to exploit. Additionally, some scholars believe that ensuring the creation of Pakistan served British strategic interests by giving them a reliable ally in the western Indian Ocean region, especially near the Persian Gulf and Afghanistan. This argument is supported by later events, such as Pakistan joining Western military alliances in the 1950s, although whether this was intentional foresight or later coincidence remains debated. In India, too, views differ sharply. Some nationalist historians argue that the Congress leadership agreed to partition not because they wanted it, but because they believed it was the only way to prevent a civil war that could tear India apart completely. In their view, the alternative to partition was not a united India, but an ungovernable collapse that might have triggered a prolonged civil conflict, similar to the later breakup of Yugoslavia. From this perspective, agreeing to a quick partition was the lesser of two disasters, a painful decision made to ensure that at least two functioning nations could emerge. From Pakistan's perspective, partition was not a tragedy of division but the fulfillment of a political and cultural aspiration. Many in the Muslim League believed that delaying independence would allow Congress to dominate the process and weaken their bargaining power. To them, the speed of the transfer of power was not a careless rush, but a necessary step to guarantee Pakistan's existence before circumstances allowed opponents to undermine it. Even today, Pakistani historians emphasize that the demand for Pakistan was rooted in genuine political fears and aspirations, not British manipulation or hurried negotiations. The truth, as always in history, lies somewhere between these competing interpretations. Partition was neither purely a rushed accident nor entirely a deliberate design. It was a process shaped by long-standing mistrust, political ambitions, collapsing administrative structures, global geopolitics, and the personal choices of a few powerful individuals, all unfolding under the pressure of time, fear, and uncertainty. The British wanted to exit quickly. The Congress wanted stability, the Muslim League wanted guarantees, and the communities on the ground wanted security, all valid concerns that clashed in a moment of historical urgency. As the dust settled after 1947, both India and Pakistan spent decades dealing with the human, economic, and psychological scars of partition. Refugee camps became cities. Divided families rebuilt their lives. New borders created new identities, new conflicts, and new political realities. Over time, narratives hardened. In India, partition became a story of betrayal and loss. In Pakistan, it became a story of triumph and survival. Yet beneath these national stories lies a deeper, more complicated truth, one in which fear, hope, strategy, miscalculations, and human emotion all played a role. And so the question remains, was the partition of India a rushed decision or a strategic plan? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the haste came from strategy, and the strategy was shaped by haste. What is certain is that the speed of the process, the geopolitical calculations behind it, and the failure to anticipate human suffering combined to shape one of the most defining events of the modern world. The story of partition reminds us that history is rarely made by one decision, one leader, or one motive. It is made by the convergence of many forces, often moving faster than anyone can control.